we live in this extraordinary place, and our education did not inform us of that. And it couldn't, because it came from the West. And that which came from indigenous cultures was metaphorical and beautiful and extraordinary and accurate, by the way, but we weren't listening to that.
Welcome to the Garrison Institute Presents The Common Good. I'm Jonathan F.P. Rose, the co-founder of the Garrison Institute. This series begins with a simple, essential truth, that we are all deeply interconnected. Every breath we take, every drop of water, every act of kindness or cruelty ripples through the vast web of life we share. The Garrison Institute was founded on the belief that by deepening our awareness of that interconnection, we can begin to shape a world that is more compassionate, resilient, and just. In each episode, I'll speak with extraordinary thinkers, scientists, and visionaries. Together, we'll explore what it means to serve the common good in our time, and how, acting through wisdom and compassion, we can help weave a more beautiful and enduring fabric of life for all. Today, we are honored to welcome Paul Hawken, a visionary environmentalist, author, entrepreneur, and founder of Projects Drawdown and Regeneration. Paul's new book, Carbon, the Book of Life, invites us to rethink our partnership and relationship with carbon, not as a villain, but as the very fabric of life on Earth. Paul, welcome.
Thank you so much. Good to see you, Jonathan.
You too. So I remember maybe it was 10 years ago, something like that, we were sitting on an outdoor terrace overlooking the Tyrolean Sea in the Amalfi Coast, sitting side by side, and you told me you were going to write a book about carbon.
Actually, it's more interesting because I wrote the proposal in Italy. You were working on your book, and I sent that proposal in 11 years ago. And in the meantime, I did Drawdown, the book, and then I did Regeneration. And my publisher was getting nervous and impatient and saying, hey, what about this carbon book? We paid you a lot of money 11 years ago, and we keep renewing it, and would you please do it? And otherwise, we're just going to cut it off. So I started to write the book. And it's completely different than the proposal I wrote, because 10 years of watching the climate movement and seeing it, observing it, being a part of it, of course, changed entirely what I proposed at that time. Yeah.
And so what was the original idea and how did it evolve?
The original idea was just a fascinating list of things that people are doing around the world, not just solutionism like in Drawdown, but in everything from grammar to cities to a wide variety of things. So it was all over the map. And it didn't have any discipline to it so much as it was just looking at human beings in relationship to the atmosphere, climate, and their habitat, that is to say, the Earth.
But it evolved, and really what it is in some ways, it's the book of life. So let's start with carbon, and we're going to talk a lot about life, but let's start with carbon, because what you're really saying is carbon is this essential molecule or atom from which all these other relationships unfold.
It is that for sure, and it's the only element that can store energy and has memory when it's linked together.
Describe how it has memory.
Well, DNA, that's the element in the world that stores energy in various and sundry forms. We know it now as fossil fuel energy or gas or things like that, but we don't mine sodium or phosphorus or nitrogen gases for energy. We do it for carbon. So there's great carbon stores on Earth. They all come from marine life or swamp forests, and that's what we're burning.
And carbon, by the way, also has these different valences, these different ways the electrons can organize. If I remember correctly, that's actually how we carbon date things. So that's actually how we know some of the history of the Earth.
Exactly. But carbon has been a mysterious element in many ways. And I did talk about in the book about, well, we never knew where it came from. We assumed it came from the Big Bang, and that was disproven. That idea that everything exploded in 1 second into what the world is today was like, no, didn't happen. Maybe the Big Bang happened, maybe not. I mean, it happened, but maybe that wasn't the origin. Maybe there was Big Bangs before that. But the thing is, we really didn't know where carbon came from until the 50s, 60s. And atoms we'll get too technical here, but valences and resonances and so forth. And the math is 3 helium make a carbon, and the math is perfect.
Wait, just explain that. So 3 heliums make a carbon. So helium is one of the simplest atoms.
When you fuse 2 hydrogen, you get helium, and there's an extra neutron flying around, and that's called energy. And that's why the sun is so bright and warm, because it's the gravitational force of the sun really is compressing and causing fusion. So, I mean, it stood to reason that if you do the math, that 3 helium makes C12, I mean, it's like, thank you. And it's just not true. And when we discovered it wasn't true, it meant we didn't know where life came from.
Where did it come from?
Well, it came from giant red stars when a sun starts to exhaust itself. And what happens is that the different elements that are being created, eventually in the sun through fusion actually get to iron. And iron is the 26th element, and it has reactions, but it doesn't give off any energy whatsoever. And so what happens as iron accumulates, it reaches a certain point where the star gets bigger and better and has less energy, then explodes into a supernova and scatters that in these trillion-mile wide clouds all over the nebulae. And they contain all these elements for sure, and they're protected from cosmic rays by this cloud. But then it reforms again, eventually gravitationally and with rocks and rubble and sand and so forth, and creates a solar system. We're living in a universe that explodes and then refashions itself. And every day, 86,000 solar systems, suns that have solar systems, are exploding as far as we know. But what happens as the star gets bigger and bigger, there is, according to Fred Hoyle, an astronomer who's the one who deciphered it, is there's a moment where 2 helium get together and make beryllium for a trillionth of a second. You get beryllium and another alpha particle, which is helium, combines and you get carbon, which is in 99% of every single part of this earth has carbon in it. And of course, every cell of our body has 1.2 trillion carbon atoms. And so its ubiquity is extraordinary. But when you give it its origin, you think, how could that be? And it gives you some sense of the dimensionality and the age of the universe. It's just extraordinary. And that's really how we discovered the origin, the source of carbon. And it's interesting because Fred Hoyle, an amazing astronomer, this avid atheist, he coined the term Big Bang as a term of derision. He coined the term because he thought that was ridiculous, that the idea of the universe was created as we know it in a millisecond of an explosion of catastrophic force. So he was the one who suggested this theory of carbon formation, and he went to Caltech, and basically great school, great scientist, great physicist, and they laughed at him. They mocked him. They made fun of him. They just were so derisive of his theory. But he kept hammering at them and said, hey, take nitrogen, bombard it with protons, work backwards and see if you don't create C12. And they finally did it. And voila, he was correct. And he and Whaling and Fowler, the other scientists he worked with, posted a paper, peer-reviewed, went everywhere, big deal. And then Hoyle, though, said, yeah, but you cannot explain the universe and how this works without there being a super intelligence. In other words, yes, physics is there, but the way this has happened and the extraordinary resonances and gradients and things that sort of conspire, if you will, to create the universe as we know it is not possible without a higher intelligence. Well, that just made every single physicist angry. And so Fowler and Whaling won the Nobel Prize for the paper that Hoyle was a lead author on, and he did not get the Nobel Prize.
So there's something amazing in this cosmic process. Our physics, certainly up until the time of Einstein, was moving towards a mechanistic and a complicated view of how the world got put together. But post-quantum theory, and relatively too, but we more and more now to see it from a complexity point of view versus a complicated point of view. And in complexity, there's emergence. There's this thing that happens when things interact with things that interact that create new things that you couldn't predict from a purely mechanistic point of view. So let's talk about complexity in this unfolding of life.
Your point is extremely well taken because we live in a very complicated world, and the climate movement keeps forwarding ideas and technologies and proposals that actually deal with complication, the complication of global warming to start with, of course, the sources of it, and then how to rectify, change, sequester, and all these different verbs. And it's based on the understanding of complication. And just as you did, and I am avoiding the word complex, because complicated systems, the sense of complication came from the nounism of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and so forth, which is to separate things and understand their relationship for sure. But I also call it nounism, where you wanted to name all the different parts of the world that you were discovering from Darwin on up, and basically then to study them. What are their interactions and what are their nature and so forth. So it's all about the science of distinction and separation, whereas ecosystems are inseparable from the world, really. It's not like there's an ecosystem you can isolate it over there. For sure, if you have a wetland in the middle of a desert, it's a distinct ecosystem. But it's not distinct in terms of how it interacts on the margins with its sandy borders or its whatever. And so that's a complex system. And I think what we're trying to do is understand and then deal with a very complex system with the mind of complication. That if we just can fix this and do that, and we're going to capture carbon, direct air capture, carbon capture systems, we're going to liquefy it, we're going to pump it into geological formations and all this sort of stuff. Technically, that is possible. I don't doubt that, not at all. But the idea that somehow we're going to fix things, that very verb is a very, with all due respect to my gender and yours too, but a very male verb, that somehow we have that ability and capacity of our knowledge to fix what we have basically broken. And what we've broken is not the carbon cycle. We haven't broken that. You can't break it. We've accelerated so rapidly that we have global warming. And one of the problems with the discussion and the climate movement is that we keep saying we have a climate crisis, and we do not have a climate crisis because the climate cannot have a crisis. It's impossible. We do have a crisis. It's right here where we live. And it's a human crisis. It's a crisis of understanding, of taking, of extraction, of really converting, if you will, the living world into an inanimate world of things and electricity and energy and roads and buildings, et cetera, et cetera. And so really Carbon, the Book of Life, is really trying to, can we just walk that back a little bit? Not what we've done as humanity, not the brilliance at all, but really to look at it from a point of view where we're inseparably connected to everything that we do, say, make. And now what you see, a different world, it's not actually different, but you're seeing it in a way that actually is the world that we live in.
And there have been thousands of human cultures throughout history and one's extent today that see the world from this deeply interdependent view, that deeply understand how everything's interconnected. So it's not necessarily a human flaw, but it is a flaw of this culture that we have been so arrogant as to amplify, to magnify certain actions without understanding or acknowledging or accepting the reactions that they're causing in these cascading effects. So the pathway, it seems to me, is the pathway towards a rebalanced world is not one that takes more technology and more complexity, that actually takes us further and further down that road. Just to amplify that, when you build all these machines, then you have to do all this mining. There are consequences to every single thing. My friend Dan Goleman likes to say, we love to call these things side effects, but they're not side effects, they're effects. They're just the effects of what we do.
Right.
As we've just been describing, it's a mindset flaw, but there are lots of mindsets, and you write about some of them that actually see how to work within this beautiful world of life.
What has become evident is that not just only the Western culture that came out of the Enlightenment, and prior to that, the European cultures spread around the world in boats. And basically, because of the papal decrees, doctrine of discovery said that they could take it anything they wanted. And the land was theirs, the people were theirs, the resources were theirs. There's a requiremento, which the Spanish were required to read out loud to the peoples that they discovered. And I imagine these people in, say, tropical areas, and so they didn't have a lot of clothing on, and these Spanish come off these boats, which they'd never seen before, these huge oaken boats with helmets and silver and adornments and swords and rifles. And they read this thing, and these people are going, who the are these people that just landed ashore? I shouldn't laugh, because what the requiremento said is that everything here belongs to us. And that includes all of your women, all of your children, and anything else that we require. And in other words, we're going to take whatever we want, and so forth. And people had no idea what they said, of course. But that came out of the papal doctrine of discovery, that statement. And that's been operative ever since. We have become accustomed to going wherever we want, to take whatever we want from whomever we want, including the people themselves, of course. And we still do that to this very day. So that's the dilemma we are in, comes from basically objectifying the living world. And we're still doing that in our rhetoric about how to solve the problem. In other words, we have objectified carbon. It's a thing. It's an element. It's the bad boy. It's a culprit. We got to get rid of it. We got to bring it back down to earth. We got all this kind of thing about carbon, many other things as well. But the fact is that mindset is the mindset that actually caused basically the loss of the living world. And the difference between the 5,000 cultures that were there then, and most of whom are still here in some form, is that their lives, and there's exceptions, obviously the Mongolians and so forth, but with putting that aside, they lived in the same place hundreds and thousands of years. So they learned where they lived. And they learn how to sustain themselves and how to eat and medicines and hunting and the animals and the relationships and so forth. So they co-evolved, right? They're an emergent property of that place as well once they showed up as another creature. But I think what we're seeing right now, rather than gainsaying Western science or going about indigenous knowledge, which is like, oh, we should go back. Actually, what I think we're seeing, Jonathan, is actually the empirical science of the West and the observational science of indigenous cultures actually meeting. You see that in Robin Wall Kimmerer, for example, which I think why she's so loved, adored, and popular and brilliant, by the way, is because we're meeting, and what we're discovering is a kind of what we don't know. It's so interesting, rather than we know, and this and that. That certainty and surety of Western science is sort of being blown away and being replaced by a sense of wonder and awe. And wow, we don't know this, and we don't know how plants work, and we don't know how the soil works, and we don't know that it's an organism. We don't know how every single plant in the world is communicating. We didn't even know they communicated. And we don't know how all the animals, the 3.4 trillion creatures here, they're all talking, they're all communicating. We have no idea what they're saying, and their intelligence just goes on and on and on. So Carbon, the Book of Life, was trying to say, you guess what? We live in this extraordinary place, and our education did not inform us of that. And it couldn't, because it came from the West. And that which came from indigenous cultures was metaphorical and beautiful and extraordinary and accurate, by the way, but we weren't listening to that.
So he referred to plants communicating because we've now come to understand that all of life has intelligence, that plants have a lot of intelligence.
Yeah, the Italians have really led this in terms of, on the science side, we know that plants have about 20 different senses. We have 5. We can run around and do things. Plants are accessible. That is to say, they're not mobile. They have to be in one place. They can't move. The only way they move is through propagation, seeds, and sending their reproductive pollen or this or that. They themselves cannot move. And so being here a lot longer than us, 400, 450, we're not quite sure, million years, they developed ways to persist. And the ones who didn't are gone. So that involved communication eventually, that is to say, with other plants and usually their own species and eventually other species. And so they have all these different ways of really adapting to their environment. And one of them is communication. There's three ways, really. There is sound for sure, but it's supersonic. We can't hear it. There's definitely pheromones. There's chemicals, which they can issue and exude, if you will, and they can decide, maybe as a wrong verb for a plant, but these pheromones can be used or detected by the same species, all maple trees, but not oak trees. Or they can decide it's a signal to all trees. And one of the signals that exists that we don't understand is masting, which is that in large areas, for example, the oak trees will all drop their acorns at the same time. Well, who is coordinating this? And there was a theory about pollen, but actually they were doing it basically up from the wind too, so it wasn't pollen. So that's another form of communication that we don't understand, but it's also the roots and through the mycelia. I have an adage, but thing that says, we don't know where we live. And there's a beautiful quote by Jill Clapperton that says that when you're standing on the ground, you're standing on the roof of another world, because there's more life beneath the soil than there is above. This is in biomass. This is literally true, not just conceptually. But the soil itself is an organism. But there's mycelia, which is much talked about and used in many ways right now as a reference. But what we know about mycelia is that they connect to the hyphae of a root. That is this connecting point. And a scientist in the book basically took a rye seed, a kernel of rye, and then planted it to measure how many roots a single kernel of rye had. And it was 14 million roots. And the 4 were like hair roots, so he put that aside, so 10 million roots, okay. So each of those roots has a hyphae that's communicating with mycelia. The mycelia communicating, that's a verb, communicating. And well, mycelia communicating back, and basically the plant, as all plants and trees are saying to the mycelia, is, I have sugar, they're photosynthesizing and creating carbs, and that's what the mycelia need to nourish their life. And the mycelia are basically saying, I got nitrogen, I got phosphorus, you want zinc? Yeah, I can get that too, or selenium, whatever. And somehow they're transacting this. And how? What language? What noun? What verbs? I mean, it's just mind-blowing.
So nouns and verbs are just things that humans created.
Yeah.
So first of all, you look at those networks, they look exactly like neural networks. And as you pointed out in the book, we have chemical pulses that go through our neurons that create electronic valence changes, and they're doing the exact same thing. So they may not look like neurons, but they're functioning exactly like neurons. And they're woven together like neurons, and they have hubs like neurons and networks like neurons. And what's really interesting, so another one of our guests was Monica Gagliano, and she did this amazing work with trees that experienced an eclipse. And the older trees taught the younger trees how to relate to an eclipse. And you could actually measure that through the whole eclipse cycle, through the transmission of these waves, through the neurons. So they're definitely thinking something. Now, thinking may be the too human phrase, but they absolutely evidence consciousness. So they evidence awareness of their external circumstances. These whole plant and mycelium and bacteria in the soil, these whole living communities are showing consciousness, showing that they have memory, showing that they can adapt, showing that they recognize circumstances. Every phrase that you would use to describe consciousness is something that they actually do.
Yeah, Monica Gagliano is just an extraordinary scientist. And it's so interesting because when she first published work on plant communication, peer-reviewed, and she presented it to botanists, she literally got heckled by men, botanists, who just mocked her while she was presenting her paper. So that gives you a sense of the clinging to paradigms in science. And the scientists who peer review tend to be the older scientists who've been peer reviewed. And so people publishing now have a hard time because they have to publish something that get reviewed or they lose their post at a university. And yet who's reviewing it is questionable in many cases to me. And Monica is a classic example of that, where she had to go, not outside, just had to go out. And this is what I'm finding. This is what I'm discovering and so forth. I mean, it's like brave to do this because you get outlawed by your own scientific community.
But the community comes around.
Eventually,
I want to wind this back a little bit because you said there we're in this moment of this merging of indigenous traditional knowledge and science, and the indigenous traditional knowledge is what told us that the world was alive and that all these beings were our relatives and that they were all communicating with each other. And now the science, and way beyond just Monica, there's a big body of science that is showing there's this communication, although we don't know what they're saying. And just one more thing about animal communications. So it turns out now, we've known for a long time that whales have songs, but what we didn't know is that whales have hit songs and popular songs. And that whales in certain parts of the ocean will like invent a new song. And if everybody else likes it, they all start singing it. And you can actually follow that song in its cycle around the earth. And it'll like start in the Pacific and it'll show up like in the Caribbean 9 months later because it took that long to get around the world. And then a new song will come. All these species have this constant, amazing, intelligent conversation going on that we've been ignoring. And that conversation could actually be the answer to what we need to know.
Some really interesting questions are coming up. Is that, are we intelligent enough to understand the intelligence of the world? It could be that we are not the most intelligent because we're understanding intelligence through our framework. And that framework is definitely Homo sapien. And we won't take away brilliance from it. It is brilliant. But I tend to agree with those who say, I don't think we have the intelligence to understand the intelligence that we're discovering because those whales aren't singing, they're communicating. And it's very subtle. And there's messages within it as opposed to, oh, it sounds like a great tune. That's how we're hearing it initially. But when you start to parse it and using AI now and parse those songs and so forth, you're finding variations and so forth that aren't just because this whale is in the Pacific and this one is in North Atlantic. You're seeing things that we distinguish it in a certain way, but it doesn't mean that the whales listening to it distinguish it in the same way.
I want to talk about one of the things our intelligence doesn't understand, which is an aspect of evolution and how things came to be. So in your book, you have this example of the giant owl butterfly, the Caligo irolocus. So tell us the story of the giant owl butterfly.
Well, you have to see it to really appreciate it. Or even if you go to Google and look at a picture of it, basically eye spots on butterflies, and they look like pupils.
And they're spaced just the same distance as a bird's eye.
Well, a bird's eye or an owl's eye, it depends. And basically it's to prevent predation. The color of monarchs is not about eye spots. It's a color that says I'm poisonous to birds. And that's because they eat milkweed, which is poisonous. And so you die if you eat me. So the eye spots are basically to prevent predation. Like, I'm not going to eat this owl. I try to go at it as a bird. The question is, how did they... that is this particular butterfly or other butterflies with eye spots, how do they create eye spots? Just to say they're there. And then I did research this, and it's these papers about genetics. Okay, fine, thank you, genetics. But it didn't explain. And I look at the Mexican owl butterfly, and I look at that eye spot, and I draw, and I'm a good drawer. I'd be hard pressed to replicate that pupil of an owl using all the time I had and all the tools I have as an illustrator. It's just so well done. So it's not just like a kind of a simulacrum of an owl. It's like, whoa.
Random DNA mutations don't seem, they may give you a Jackson Pollock looking butterfly.
Right.
But how they came to an eye-looking butterfly.
I would love to see a Jackson Pollock butterfly, but what we're seeing is a coevolution. And the question is, well, how did that happen? Because you never saw a butterfly walk up to an owl or fly up to an owl and stare at it and going, okay, got it. All the things that we know of knowing don't apply.
Right. So what this is telling us is that the book of life itself is written in a language that we don't know yet, and a language that our Western science, by its very nature, is taking us farther away from knowing. But it is within the human capacity, I think, to sense and maybe to know some of it. And as I said, we've seen this in traditional knowledge, and we see it when we ourselves slow down and we open ourselves up to the feelings of awe and the feelings of love versus the feelings of analysis, we can come to resonate. We may not know it, but we can resonate with it.
Absolutely. We gained ways of knowing. I'm talking about the West, there's no such we, but I mean in the West, starting with Newtonian physics and other observational from Darwin, et cetera, extraordinary knowledge. I give an example. People could predict weather 2 years in advance accurately, or the Micmac in southeastern Canada and Maine could listen to a mother tree, a pine tree, basically a big tree in the fall, in October, around sunset, and listen to the wind soughing through the branches and the pine needles, of course. And then that sound, that particular sound of that tree at that moment, then became the name of the tree. Now, we don't have any words in our million-word vocabulary in English for that word. We can name the sound of the wind going through, rustling, soughing, all this stuff, but not of the particular tree. They would remember that name. They didn't write it down. And 10 years later, when they saw the tree, they knew the name of the tree. And then when they listened to it at the same time of the year, they could detect whether the tree was healthy or something had happened to it. So what is that? What's that about? It's incomprehensible in a way, but that's just what happens.
It's incomprehensible from, I'm going to wind you back to what you called nounism, but it's not incomprehensible from, verbism is the wrong word, but deep relationality.
Right.
When you sense that you're deeply interconnected with all of life and that you are part of the flow of life, as you experience it, you be with it, you resonate with it, then you in effect grok all of its data and not just pieces of its data. So there's a way of knowing, actually where I'm pointing to is that it seems that the things we call life and the things we call mind are more of the same than they're separate. That mind permeates life and life permeates mind. And that may extend way beyond Earth too.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that in talking the way we are, subjects we're choosing to talk about, it's likely to actually objectify it as well and to be sense, oh, I can't do that, or I didn't know that, or they can do that, or whales do that, and to have the same sort of sense of separation, but only with a new guise, a new understanding of the world we live in. I said, well, how do I, disconnect in that such a way? Do I have to study, read, go spend, years in the jungle or whatever? All that sort of stuff will come up maybe. But the thing that we have to understand is that as the loss of the living world and people and children and cultures accelerates, and it is accelerating, whether it's fish in the sea or languages or you name it. And the thing is that grief is really important. Because grief, understanding and embracing the grief that you might suppress, but that grief actually is the window into an intelligence that we all have that connects us. And that grief is connected to love. You cannot feel grief unless you love something. And the love comes from our heart. And it's the organ that always tells us the truth, always, invariably. And so we have this extraordinary intelligence within us and in our body, in our organ. You can call the heart the organ. I'm not sure. It's beyond that, really. So we emanate that, and we should be gentle with ourselves as well. Are we stone ignorant? Are we killing the world? Yep. No question. Are we selfish? Yes. We all know that. But within each person, no matter how weird they are or how wonderful they are, is the same mechanism, even within President Trump. And can we obscure it? Can we cover it up? Of course, we do it. We see it. We know that's true, but it is within us. And so I think that talking about the mystery of the world that we live in, beautiful, complex, extraordinary wonderment that surrounds us and so forth, we shouldn't let it be separate from what's in us.
Beautiful. So then I think that's the source for how we move into regenerative action. So you've written a wonderful book about regeneration, and you listed all kinds of actions. To me, there's a precedent to the action which is the mindset that leads to the regenerative action. And it sounds like you're saying that heartfelt wisdom is the source. So talk about that connection between that heartfelt wisdom and actually taking the action in the world.
All of us, in one way or another, understand or have had the experience of seeing something taken away or harmed or disturbed or killed, and our response to that. Where we are in the world today in terms of the human population is the understanding that we live in a degenerating world, and it's degenerating on any levels you want to measure it. And the only way forward to humanity is regeneration. That's simply stated is to create more life instead of less. That may be very binary, but it's simple, and we can all understand it from a 2-year-old to a 90-year-old. That is a core understanding. I see regeneration as sort of an awakening, really. And yes, now specifically, I live here, I do this, I want that, I make that. And there's things you can do that shift what you do from inadvertently or unintentionally being degenerative to being regenerative. But the measure is simple. It's does it create more life or less? And it's going to be difficult to get there, in one jump and one leap. You can't, but you can do it in increments, but you at least know where you're going, whether it's in food, farming, housing, energy, transportation, communication. It goes on and on and on, all the things that we have created and that we depend upon. And so that's the regeneration movement, which is alive and well in the world, but it tends to be community-based, small, a farm, this, that. Restore.eco, Restore, Tom Crowther's organization. It's Restore without an E. There's 250,000 sites on the earth that are currently revitalizing, restoring, and regenerating the places and people where they are. Okay, so that's us, that's humanity. And we'll never read about it, even with Benjamin Wallace Wells and brilliant writers in the New York Times. We'll never read about it because it's not big enough. It's too singular. It's like, well, yeah, that's nice. If there's a story or somebody, maybe if they get an award, but we don't see that. What we see is the opposite, because that lights up the amygdala. And we have an amygdala method of communicating right now, which is basically, does it get you upset, concerned, frightened, this, that? Great. Click through it, read more. And there you have Google, there you have the New York Times, there you have everything else. So it's important that we really look at our inputs and where are we getting information from? And I'm trying to create a new organization called the Alliance for Regeneration, which is simply this. It's just like, hey, you want to find out what's going on where and whom and have meetups or this or that? There it is. It itself is not a narrator, a teller, a definer. It's actually just simply saying there's an emergent quality to humanity right now, which is basically unseen, unreported, and except in small little ways, and a small meaning in terms of the number of listeners to podcasts, the number of readers of a certain book, the number of participants in a community event. And I think it's really important that without ignoring what's happening in the dissolution and the degradation of the earth, our politics, our humanity, we need to be aware of that. At the same time, I think we also need to see that humanity is extraordinary and beautiful, and we are, and so both are true.
This field is growing. And so you described there are these lots of movements. There's a lot of people more and more trying to figure out how they create regenerative food systems. There's a big movement in building and housing construction to be using more, thinking about whole systems, what I call building biologically, using mass timber and selectively harvesting forests and using that in ways that you can not only assemble buildings, but ultimately in the future disassemble them and regenerate them. And in many fields, there's this growing desire. We're beginning to figure these things out. And so maybe, just maybe, if we can illuminate them enough and connect them enough, that we can infuse our culture with more of a sense of regeneration.
My next book is called Upstream, and basically it starts with that fable of the river, which is, being next to a river or whatever you're doing there, picnic or this or working, and then you see somebody floating down the river who's flapping around, obviously going to drown. They don't know how to swim, and though you go into the river and you pull them out, of course. And then you go back to work or whatever, and then there's another one, and you go, well, okay. And you do it again, and you do it either several times or 3 times or whatever before somebody says we should go upstream and find out who's throwing them in the river. And that's upstream. And we are now really trying to solve the human crisis, the climate situation, global warming. we're trying to solve everything downstream instead of going to cause. And if you don't know cause, you're not going to get to cure. So much of the money that Microsoft and Google are pouring into these carbon offsets and all that sort of stuff is like, yeah, good, but that won't get you upstream. Is there Band-Aids?
And so I want to end with asking you about the idea of the common good. There have been many, many societies that have thought about the common good in a multi-temporal way. So they think about continuing to do things to honor their ancestors and to do things to prepare for the benefit of the future generations. We live now in this hyper-individualistic society. And anyway, there's all kinds of forces that have pushed us towards individualism. Do you feel the emergence of forces that are reweaving us back into this multi-temporal commons?
Yeah, I think people one by one going to do that. I think it may be because we hit some walls and some people realize, actually, I depend on my community, that we are interdependent, or we need to be now because the supply chains have been interrupted. And I just took it for granted that my credit card would give me everything I needed. And instead didn't pay attention to community, people, family, listening. Listening is really important, and sharing. That is, whether it's a good or whether it's knowledge, whether it's an understanding or whether it's your time. I feel like that is there coming back to the fore in those places where it has been lost. So that's, yeah, the common good. And good can only be common in that sense.
And so what you're describing is a recognition of our reliance upon our neighbors. And maybe it's we begin to understand that our neighbors include all sentient beings and not just humans.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that people can do if they want to have a joyous experience with their neighbors is to get an ultraviolet flashlight and go on at a dark night and then point it, and you'll see all these Lepidoptera and moths. And in psychedelic, patterns, like, whoa, and they're everywhere. I mean, unless you live in a really degraded place ecologically, and you see, these are there every night. Your neighbors, they're pollinators. They're as important a pollinator population as the European bee, and there they are. And they're all different sizes and this and that and colors. And how many nights have you gone out, whatever, take out the garbage, walk your pet or whatever, and not seen a single one? And yet there they are. So it's kind of like an aperture. It's like taking something and opening up an aperture that you didn't know was there. And then what? What do you think? I mean, what do you feel? Like, where am I? Like, oh, I'm here with a community, right? The greatest number of any species on Earth is moths. So it seems like small, but take your children out, or take the neighbor's children if you don't have them, and just go out and see the world. And children get it immediately, which is, oh my gosh. But I think adults will too.
All right, Paul, this has been a wonderful conversation. You just reminded me of Thomas Berry, the Catholic priest who said that the universe was a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects.
Oh, yeah.
You were describing we need to experience ourselves more in this communion of subject relationship. Your book is a beautiful pathway, reminder, mind opener, connector, weaver of stories about this communion of all of life. So thank you so much for its contribution and all the other contributions you have made to the world in this work.
And likewise to you, Indiana, Garrison Institute, extraordinary endeavor that has persisted for decades, that really has transformed the lives of many, many people. So thank you.
Thank you to our guest, Paul Hawken. The Common Good is a production of the Garrison Institute and is hosted by me, Jonathan F.P. Rose. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the podcast. Please send us a note at podcast@garrisoninstitute.org and let us know what you think. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts. This show is produced by the Garrison Institute with production and marketing from The Podglomerate. Its theme music was composed by Jonathan F.P. Rose and performed by Jog Blues. We look forward to being with you again soon.